Major funding for the rebroadcast of this series has been provided by the Charles H. Revson Foundation, the estate of Mortimer J. Harrison, and the Jacob Burns Foundation. Additional funding has been provided by the Lemberg Foundation. Major funding for this series was originally provided by the Charles H. Revson Foundation, Petrie Stores Corporation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funding was provided by the following: a complete donor list is available from PBS.
She rose up from the waters of New York Harbor in 1886 like some ancient goddess, presiding silently over the gateway to a continent.
Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, and her name, Mother of Exiles. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore.
These are the words of the poet Emma Lazarus. It was no accident that as a Jew, she could voice the dreams of immigrants of every faith, of every nationality who came to this land. America was different. Large enough and broad enough to allow for all beliefs. Rich enough in natural resources to answer the needs of all who came. America was different. It promised those who came that what they might have been was less important than what they might become. On an island in New York Harbor stand a cluster of abandoned government buildings. The nearby docks and empty ferry slips speak of a time when thousands of men, women, and children arrived here each day and first set foot on American soil. 80 years ago, millions of immigrants passed through these halls and crossed the threshold to a new life in a new land. Past the Statue of Liberty they came, and on to Ellis Island in the closing years of the 19th century, by the thousands, by the millions, and also one by one. The poor, the disenfranchised, the hopeful, the adventurous, the persecuted, the oppressed. One by one, from Italy, Ireland, Germany, and Russia, and among them nearly 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe. To the tapestry which was America, more than 100 ethnic groups would bring their special threads of color and of culture. It was not only the size and the richness of the continent to which they came that made America different. It was what they brought with them and how they interacted with each other that made America different. America was a nation peopled by immigrants, a nation whose very foundations had been laid by immigrant settlers as early as the 16th century. Many of the first settlers in America had crossed the Atlantic seeking a refuge from political and religious intolerance in Europe. The Atlantic was a road of escape, open to anyone who could raise passage. It was also a commercial highway. Among those involved in Atlantic shipping and trade were descendants of those Jews who had been expelled from Spain and Portugal at the end of the 15th century. In 1654, a small group of Portuguese Jews sailing from Brazil to Amsterdam were blown off course and stranded without money. 23 Jewish men, women, and children made their way to the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, hoping to find in this place the toleration their kinsmen enjoyed in Amsterdam itself. The governor of New Amsterdam, Peter Stuyvesant, a man of many prejudices, wrote to his superiors in Holland,
"We pray that the deceitful race be not allowed to infect this new colony. Giving them liberty, we cannot refuse the Lutherans and Papists."
But Jews were deeply involved in Dutch commerce. Stuyvesant's superiors were sympathetic but firm.
"We have decided that the Portuguese Jews may travel and trade to and in New Netherland and live and remain there. You will now govern yourself accordingly."
New Amsterdam, later to become New York, remained a place where Jews might settle, but in other places there was little toleration. Many of America's first colonists had brought with them the prejudices of Europe. In Massachusetts, the Puritans forbade other forms of worship than their own. In Virginia, the Anglican Church was state-supported, and heresy was a crime. But other colonies were run as commercial ventures, and anyone was welcome who could develop their land or contribute to their trade. In the course of the 18th century, a few Jews came to the new continent as ship owners and merchants. They settled in the port cities of Savannah, Charleston, Philadelphia, Newport, and New York. In these cities, it mattered little that they were Jews. Everyone was a foreigner. To that extent, everyone was alike. They became a small but integral part of colonial society. But the very freedom of America that so benefited individuals was dangerous to the preservation of a Jewish community. The Jews who came to America left behind them all the institutions that had daily reinforced their identity as Jews: the rabbis, the Jewish teachers, the religious schools. In America, they were on their own. Without the leadership and structure of a separate Jewish community, they were free to set aside their Jewishness if they wished, and many of them did. And even if they wanted to remain Jews, with whom could they pray, or socialize, or, most importantly, marry? There were so few Jews that it was almost impossible to live a Jewish life in colonial America. What kept the Jewish community alive in these early years was a continuing but small infusion of new Jewish immigrants from abroad. By the 18th century, the bustling ports of the New World were a vital link in the trade routes of the British Empire. But British rule and British taxes soon came to be resented by many of the prosperous colonists. In these quiet streets of Philadelphia, a storm of protest was unleashed. Delegates from all the colonies gathered, and in July of 1776 proclaimed their defiance of British rule. The forces of the British Empire were marshaled against the revolt. 5 years, the struggle continued. The fragile union of American forces was constantly on the verge of collapse, but it held for long enough to defeat the British. Here in this room, in 1787, delegates gathered to write a contract that would bind the states together for their mutual defense. For this contract, the Constitution, to be accepted by all, it had to be amended by a set of declarations known as the Bill of Rights.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
To bring together the diversity of interests and peoples that was America, toleration had been made a fundamental principle of American law. In 1790, George Washington visited this synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. To its congregation, he addressed a letter that has become a classic statement of religious freedom in America. The citizens of the United States of America all possess alike liberty of conscience. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. The letter is signed G. Washington. In the towns and villages of a growing nation, different religious groups were now living side by side. The Jews, a small fraction of the population, only a few thousand in number, were fully integrated in the nation, joining even in the government of the land. The Constitution guaranteed the equal rights of all citizens, though it could not do away with their prejudices. Mordecai Manuel Noah, a Jewish playwright and a prominent politician, was appointed Sheriff of New York in 1822. What a pity, wrote one New Yorker, that Christians are to be hung by a Jew. What a pity, replied Sheriff Noah, that Christians should have to be hung. In 1807, a man named Fulton harnessed steam to propel riverboats along the great waterways that led to the interior of the continent. Within 5 years, the adventurous were being advised of regular service from the eastern seaboard into the wilderness of Ohio and Kentucky. The news of opportunities on the American frontier reached as far as Europe. Before long, settlers were arriving by the thousands. In the 1850s, spurred by political turmoil in Europe, 1 million came from the German lands alone, and among them more than 100,000 German-speaking Jews. It was the beginning of a substantial Jewish presence in America. Leaving behind the close-knit Jewish communities of Europe, these Jews discovered in the backwoods of this continent a solitary way of life unlike any they had ever known. Throughout this frontier region were thousands of remote farmsteads, hundreds of isolated settlements that had only one tie to the outside world, the itinerant peddler. For many of the young Jewish men who came to America, A horse and a cart full of goods were an early step on the road toward fortune. The peddler was a welcome guest on the frontier. He brought news. He brought goods. He brought the necessities the pioneer family could not make for itself. But frontier life was often perplexing for the Jewish immigrant. From the diary of a peddler in the 1840s.
We have left our friends and acquaintances, our relatives and our parents, our language and our customs, only to sell our wares in the wild places of America, in isolated farmhouses and tiny hamlets. Leading such a life, none of us is able to observe the smallest commandment. On Sunday, every farmer urges me to attend church.
A Jewish peddler striving to survive found it difficult to avoid working on Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, difficult to observe the dietary laws of his people. On the American continent, with its frontier ways and scattered settlements, the immigrant had to take life as he found it. He had to leave behind his old language, his old customs and experiences. He had to become a pioneer among other pioneers. It started with a 100-pound pack with peddlers who trudged mile after weary mile. In time, the pack gave way to the one-horse wagon. If he was fortunate, the Jewish peddler saved and eventually opened a general store. The general store frequently became the focus of a permanent settlement. Because he was an early settler, the storekeeper frequently became the sheriff or mayor or leading citizen of the town. Other Jews might join him there and form a small Jewish congregation. The German Jews became part and parcel of the epic opening of the American West. Jewish merchants were among many immigrants who contributed in these years to the development of a new America. Communities all over the land were under construction to keep pace with a growing population. By 1860, in the swampy District of Columbia, an ambitious program of construction was underway. With boundless energy and enthusiasm, Americans dreamed of one nation reaching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But this land full of hope and ambition was also a land deeply divided. An intractable quarrel between North and South over slavery and states' rights was tearing the country apart. (1861). Immigrants arriving at New York, Atlanta, or Baltimore were enlisted to fight on the battlefields of the Civil War, to give their lives for a cause they barely understood. It was a bloody war, a heartbreaking war, a war between brothers. Some 7,000 Jews fought in the Union Army. At least 3,000 fought for the Confederacy. For 4 years, the war dragged on until in 1865, the Union forces at last prevailed. More than 500,000 Americans died in the Civil War, more than in any other war America has ever fought. It was at great cost that the United States were reunited. needs of war had catapulted the industrial North into an explosive economic and commercial expansion. New factories created new jobs by the thousands. Wanted 1 million men, good wages. And the immigrants came in ever-increasing numbers. The factories were humming, and the railroads reaching outward to the frontier and beyond. Over the next 40 years, the continent was spanned by a network of iron rails. It was a time of brash individualism, of the discovery and exploitation of seemingly endless natural resources. It was a time of untrammeled and unregulated speculation. Out of the tumult of unbridled competition, there emerged a new society. The rich and powerful, the notorious, the famous. Andrew Carnegie, the son of a Scottish weaver. His steelworks would make him the richest man in the world. Jay Gould, a country store clerk from upper New York State, who rose to control many of the nation's railroads. John D. Rockefeller, an oil man from Cleveland, whose father had been a petty tradesman. They moved with the frontier, the physical frontier, and the frontiers of opportunity and ingenuity wherever they might lie. In Leadville, Colorado, Meyer Guggenheim, a Jewish immigrant from Switzerland, purchased sight unseen 2 silver mines with money he had made as a peddler in the South. The silver mines were flooded. He pumped them out and discovered to his disappointment that they contained little silver, but a low grade of copper ore instead. With his 7 sons, he developed refining processes that would make that ore profitable. In doing so, they established a foundation for the entire American copper industry. From remote mining centers and cattle towns in the west, livestock and minerals were shipped by rail to the east. In return came manufactured goods to fill the shelves of general stores in towns and villages throughout the nation.
And her name, Mother of Exiles. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore.
These are the words of the poet Emma Lazarus. It was no accident that as a Jew, she could voice the dreams of immigrants of every faith, of every nationality who came to this land. America was different. Large enough and broad enough
Major funding for the rebroadcast of this series has been provided by the Charles H. Revson Foundation, the estate of Mortimer J. Harrison, and the Jacob Burns Foundation. Additional funding has been provided by the Lemberg Foundation. Major funding for this series was originally provided by the Charles H. Revson Foundation, Petrie Stores Corporation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funding was provided by the following: A complete donor list is available from PBS.
She rose up from the waters of New York Harbor in 1886 like some ancient goddess, presiding silently over the gateway to a continent.
Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch.
To allow for all beliefs. Rich enough in natural resources to answer the needs of all who came. America was different. It promised those who came that what they might have been was less important than what they might become. On an island in New York Harbor stand a cluster